Okay, I'm going to spend some time talking about some personal experiences, part of which I experienced myself, and I have some memories of those, and others that were sort of incorporated memories that I picked up, I'm sure, from things that my sister said and other people said. But basically, they're going to be personal accounts of some of my experiences in camp. I'd like to start with my parents, because they were a major part of the whole experience in camp. My mother was born near San Jose, California, in 1911. And so she was an American citizen when all of this happened. My father came from Hiroshima in 1917, and he was 13 years old. So he was an immigrant alien at the time. They were married in 1931 and settled in Atwater, California, which is a small farming community just about an hour north of Fresno. They bought the farm through the help of a friend of my mother's who had gone to high school with her, and he became an attorney and later became the president of the Bank of America and also served as a representative in the state legislature of California. But he helped my parents buy the property. And they needed his help because at the time, Japanese aliens were not allowed to buy land. And my mother, being an American citizen, she was able to buy land, and it was legal. So he was a major help in helping my family get started. There were a lot of anti-Japanese laws that basically restricted immigration, and as I mentioned, prohibited land ownership. So that was part of the sort of atmosphere and context within which all of this took place. My sister was born in 1932, I was born in 1938, and my younger brother was born in December of 1939. So that was our family when Pearl Harbor happened. Pearl Harbor was, I think, similar to what for later generations the assassination of President Kennedy was, and then later for another generation, 9/11, that tragedy. Pearl Harbor was on that kind of a scale, and it literally turned the whole Japanese community on the West Coast upside down. So my parents, I was 4 at the time, so I wasn't aware of that. But for my parents, it was a major tragedy. Here, my father's home country had perpetrated this attack. My mother's, while she was born in this country, she wasn't that far from her parents coming to the United States from Japan. So for her, it was also a very personal and painful event. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, on February 19th of 1942, President Roosevelt signed into law Executive Order 9066, which designated basically the entire West Coast as off limits to persons of Japanese ancestry. The actual executive order did not specify Japanese as the targeted people, but everyone understood and knew that that's who it was designed to address. The executive order came out on February 19th, so between that and the time that we were actually forced to move, it was a long and uncertain and unsettling period for everyone. I think my parents, they were farmers, so they were still trying to run the farm. This is early in the year, so it was still winter. But there were things that farmers have to do with peach orchard and almond orchard and that sort of thing. So there was this uncertainty hanging over everything for them. We didn't get an official notice with a specific date for us to move until early May. So there was a long several-month period where we were basically under this heavy weight of uncertainty. When we moved into the Merced County Fairgrounds, which was our temporary home, we had three very powerful men in the community that helped our family basically save our home and our farm. The president of the Bank of America, this was Gordon Witten, and he was the one who had gone to school with my mother. Judge Cardoza was on the municipal court, and then Bill Harmon was the farmer who owned the largest farm in the area. And those three men, over the years, had become quite powerful friends of my parents. So they bought our property for the sum of $1, held it for us throughout the war period, and then at the end of the war, when we returned, sold it back to us for $1. So we actually were one of a number of families that had something to come home to. They were also instrumental, and I'll come back to this later, but they were instrumental in helping us to reintegrate into the community after the war. As I say, that whole period following the executive order until the time that we were in this temporary camp was an unknown. And the regulations stipulated that we could only take what we could carry. So in my mind, as I think back on it, I think of suitcases and bundles that we would have carried. But I think in reality, there were more suitcases and bundles than literally we could carry, and that didn't seem to be a problem for anybody. After we had been at the Merced County Fairgrounds in the temporary assembly center, we left in early August of 1942 for Granada, Colorado, which is in the southeast corner of the state. It's in an area considered the Dust Bowl area. Camp Amache was just outside the city limits of Granada. And we were there essentially from mid-August of 42 to November of 1946 at the end of the war. Talk a little bit about the effects that it had on our family. And this is true of all families that were in this camp, as well as all the other camps. Everyone was moving from personal homes, either homes that they owned or were renting, to communal living, basically, which meant that all of our meals were taken in a communal mess hall. That meant that breakfast, lunch, and dinners were all there. And the cafeteria mess hall was basically set up in this large room with what looked like picnic benches attached to the side walls with an aisle down the middle. And each table was arranged so that you could have 2 and possibly even 3 families sitting there. So we basically moved from having family dinners and family meals to having meals with a lot of people around us, and having meals just as a family was not possible. Our homes were basically apartments, and they were small. Ours was 20 feet by 24 feet, and we were a family of 5, two adults and 3 children. And again, privacy was an issue here because there were no walls internal to the apartment. So my parents hung ropes across the room and hung sheets to give some privacy to certain sections of the apartment. The only thing that was there in the room when we first arrived were a number of metal army cots and thin mattresses. And that was basically it. There was a single light dangling from a cord in the middle of the room, and then one light fixture on one side of the room itself. And that was basically it. There was nothing else. the walls between our apartment and the next door were so thin that conversations that were taking place in apartments next to us could be heard, and which meant that if you wanted to keep something from getting beyond just your four walls, you had to whisper. We didn't have too much problem with that, but I understand that there were instances where some families had very loud arguments, and those could be heard through those thin walls. The other thing which was a dominant factor, which you weren't always aware of, because as you're walking around camp between barracks and between blocks of barracks, you would notice the buildings and the pathways and the streets. And on one level it seemed normal, but if you look down the main thoroughfare towards the edge of the camp, you could see the barbed wire fences and the gun towers. So there was that was a constant reminder of where we were, that we were behind barbed wire, detained as enemy aliens and basically in prison. One of the issues that came up for all of the adults was the loyalty questionnaire, and this was in 1943. The Army had a questionnaire with 28 questions. Most of the early questions were informational. You gave your name, your birth, your place of birth, how much education you had, what kinds of magazines and newspapers you subscribed to. Most of that was pretty innocent sounding. The final two questions had to do with whether or not you as an adult were willing to serve in the military of the United States. And that was question 27. Question 28 involved your declaring total allegiance to the United States and renouncing any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. For the Issei, the first generation, this was a difficult problem, because being enemy aliens, they were not citizens of the United States and couldn't, in any realistic, meaningful way, commit their loyalty to the United States. They were non-citizens. For the Nisei, the second generation, this was an insult to them, because no other Americans were being asked to make this declaration of loyalty. In terms of whether to serve in the military or not, again, the first generation Issei, as non-citizens, weren't eligible to serve in the military. So to say yes, they would agree to serve was a meaningless response on their part. The questionnaire itself, from what the adults could figure out, part of the intent was to ascertain one's loyalty to the country or not. The main factor that operated in the Japanese community had to do with the word giri. It's that sense of loyalty that one has to the country of one's birth. The Nisei being born in the United States meant that their essential loyalty was to the United States. Most of them had never been to Japan. They had been in this country for decades, some of them. Most of them did not speak Japanese and had no connections with Japan. The Issei, the first generation, while they were considered enemy aliens, most of them had been in this country, again, for decades. And they gave birth to children who became American citizens. But having been here this long and being prevented from becoming citizens, they still had adopted the United States as their country. And so their loyalty basically was to the United States. Following the war ended essentially in August of 1945. Camp Amache didn't close until mid-October, and my family actually didn't leave camp until late October, when we arrived home in early November. So we actually left after the camp formally had closed. The thing that helped us make a return and re-entry into our community was those three men who had served to essentially save our property for us. Because they were so powerful and influential in Atwater, they set a tone which helped us reintegrate back into the community. The other part, which was very helpful, was that my parents had been staunch members and active members of the Methodist Church. So the Methodist Church community was also part of that community of support that welcomed and helped my family reintegrate. After the war, my parents, both mom and dad, never spoke about our camp experience, particularly amongst our Caucasian friends. They didn't talk about it, I think in part because they were embarrassed by the experience, they were ashamed for it, both of which were emotions that on one level in reality had no basis for causing those feelings to occur. But in typical Japanese fashion, they experienced the embarrassment of being in jail, which in Japanese culture is not a good thing at all, and being ashamed for Pearl Harbor, because that was a tragedy perpetrated by their former home country. So both of those factors were really powerful influences in my parents never talking about the camp experience. Interesting part of that, though, when we got together with other families that had been in camp, they would talk very freely about what happened in camp. But it was never in the context of how bad it was, how terrible it was, and for all of the adults who were U.S. citizens, never a complaint or an accusing attitude towards the government for having perpetrated this against them. They would talk about how hard things had been, but it was more in a humorous vein, with the thought of, see, we actually survived all of that tragedy and all of that pressure. So it was done in a more light fashion. Underneath it, you could still hear the pain, and you knew from the looks on some of the faces, even though they were smiling, you could feel that the pain was there. So that was the only time that my parents ever talked about the camp experience. And there were times when I asked questions about what had happened in camp, particularly to my mother. My dad wasn't much of a talker at all, but I remember asking my mom some questions about camp and why certain things happened. And she would just get choked up. Tears would well up in her eyes, and she would start to very softly cry, and she would leave the room because she couldn't talk about it. So I learned at a very young age not to ask any questions about camp, which in hindsight and looking back on it is a major gap in what could have been my learning and understanding of what happened to my family. I mentioned earlier that my father, as an enemy alien, was not able to become an American citizen. Part of that had to do with the anti-Japanese laws set up by Congress, largely because of the anger and rage that American farmers had towards Japanese farmers along the whole West Coast. But there was one law that was still on the books I don't remember the date, but I think it was from 1780, that era. So it was after our nation's formation that naturalization processes were limited solely to free white Europeans. And that was still on the books at the time of World War II. In 1952, Congress passed the McCarran-Walters Act, which rescinded all of those laws, allowing now any immigrant alien to become a naturalized citizen through a formal process. In Merced County, I suspect there were several hundred, maybe 300 or 400 Japanese citizens. My father, as it turned out, was the first Japanese immigrant to become a U.S. citizen in Merced County, and that was in 1952. That was a pretty important date in our family. In looking back on my experience, my family's experiences of the evacuation and internment, I think in terms of the legacy that came out of that whole experience. And that was largely the result of my parents' handling of the whole situation. While I am certain that they had very painful memories and emotions connected with everything that happened, they didn't pass any of that on to us as the children in the family. So I never heard a bad word or a complaint or accusation lodged by my parents, either one, against the government that had done this. Instead, I came out of because of their whole approach, with a very strong and powerful sense of family and love of family. I also, again, because of the way they handled their emotions, came out with a deep sense of loyalty and love of my country and our form of government. Lastly, a third element is I have a very strong sense of justice and equality before the law. And all of those came out of what I think my parents set up as a legacy for me coming out of the war. As a result of all of that, interestingly, my first thought of an area of study when I went to the University of California was to study nuclear physics. And that was related to the dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States. I was committed at that point to study the peaceful uses of nuclear power. Once I got into that program, I decided that instead of being a scientist, I actually wanted to be in some kind of work involved with people. And I ultimately changed my major to social work, and I graduated with a master's degree in social welfare with a specialty in school counseling and school social work. The other area was when I turned 18, I registered with the Selective Service System, which was what was required at the time by the law. And I was initially given the status of 1A, which is eligible for the draft. But I had several student deferments. But when I was in graduate school, I changed my request for status to that of conscientious objector. And this came out partly out of my experiences as I experienced my parents' thoughts about the war, and my training through the Methodist Church, that I was against military service and participating in any activities of war.
Pause.
Yeah,
Is that the last card?
That's the last card, and
Okay.